morning, everyone. It's so nice to see you all. Actually, I wish I could see you all, but close enough. We'll have a chance to communicate and hopefully talk back and forth today. I am joined by my wingman, Walter, who's going to provide me with technical support, and we should have a fun day. So Walter, let's go to the first slide. Our subject today is resilient boards, and I'm going to divide this conversation into three components. First, we're going to talk about legal responsibilities of nonprofit boards. Then, we are going to talk about a structure for enabling your boards to operate with greater efficiency and effectiveness. And the third thing we're going to talk about, which I'm very excited to have this conversation with you about, is how do we really engage in a very productive board-staff partnership, not just at the ED level, but throughout the organization. So thanks, Walter. Next slide. So the question is, who am I? Now, some of you know me as an author. Some of you know me as the founder of the Nonprofit Institute. Some of you know I've been doing this work for a long period of time. But many of you don't know that once upon a time, I was a nonprofit CEO, and I took over an organization that had $5,000 in the bank and it owed $3,000 in debt. And when I left it 8 years later, this was in Massachusetts, in my hometown of Boston, we had secured $180 million in below market financing agreements for affordable housing. And the organization became a national model. And I'm very proud to say that 25 years later, it's still a national model. So why does this matter about this talk today? It matters because I had a 60-member board of directors. Now, some of you might be saying, 60-member board? Wow, that sounds like a headache waiting to happen. But it really wasn't, because I leveraged the power and the energy of that board in order to make all that work happen. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is how do you make these things happen. Okay, Walter, let's go for the next slide. So a lot of times I see boards operating like this. The boards are being served by the staff. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is the staff is running around before the board meetings, and they're getting all the reports together, and they're getting everything organized, and the board just sits there and they're being served information. And the board is bored. And so what happens when the board is bored is that people, they don't show up. They don't come to meetings, they don't read their materials in advance, because you haven't asked them to use their brains. And what is the point of having board members if they're not going to be engaged in the work of your organization? So let's start by talking about the core legal responsibilities of nonprofit boards, because I find a lot of times people don't know what the heck these are. So the first is the duty of care. And what the duty of care means is that any board member is legally obliged to give the same level of care and consideration to your work as that person is to a cause if it was their own business. So the duty of care means careful consideration. That means the board members need to do their homework. They need to read their materials before they come to the board meeting. They need to be prepared to ask questions, and they need to be engaged. The second thing is the duty of loyalty. And what the duty of loyalty means is avoiding conflicts. And that's really a pretty easy thing to do, but it's avoiding conflicts, and it's also disclosing conflicts. So Walter, I don't know if we have a picture there. Here we go. So what that means is making sure that even the moment you sign up or have board members sign up to join you, that they let you know what are the boards they're sitting on. It may be more than one board is considering applying for block grant funding or for City of San Diego Arts and Culture funding or whatever it is. And you have to make sure that when a board member is sitting in a meeting, or if you're a board member, you're wearing the hat of that organization, and that's where you are focused. It doesn't mean, and people often get confused by this, that if I sell insurance, that the board can't purchase insurance from me, or if I sell hot dogs and we're having a picnic. Hopefully one day we'll be able to have in-person fun events, that you can't buy the hot dogs from me. It just means you have to disclose the conflicts, that the board member has to leave the room when those kinds of conflicted discussions are having, so the vote is clean. And the last is the duty of obedience. And the duty of obedience means that the board member has to obey the laws governing nonprofit organizations and the bylaws of your organization. And those are really important. And I often go into rooms when I'm giving this talk live, and I ask people, how many of you were born knowing how to read a financial statement? And miraculously, no one raises their hand. And that's because people aren't born understanding these things or knowing how to read a 990. So there needs to be ongoing education so the board members understand not only your financial statements, but all aspects of your mission and what is required of them to be in legal compliance, and that's really important. So the question is, how do we wake boards up and get them engaged in the organization? So they're not bobblehead boards doing this while you're serving them. They're really serving the organization. And what we need to do is we need to reframe the discussion and reframe how we think about boards. And the way that I like to reframe it is in two modes: strategic governance and fiduciary governance. So let me explain what those things mean now. Fiduciary governance is basically everything you see on this slide. And what that means is it's all that work making sure that the trains are running on time, that the programs that you're operating are flowing from your mission, that you're spending the money that you have in the best way possible to carry out the mission, and that you're operating in compliance with the law, with your HR policies, and all of those good things. The strategic governance is the board helping you figure out how do you get from where you are right now to where you need to be in the future. And I've been thinking a lot about this because as part of my consulting work, I do a lot of board work, and I also do a lot of strategic planning work. And I think organizations are feeling a little stuck right now in the middle of COVID. Like, how do we plan and how do we move forward? Now is the perfect time to plan. It's the perfect time to engage your board in these strategic discussions about how best to deploy your resources, whether those are staff resources, financial resources, or community resources. In other words, how do you engage with other organizations in the community to move your agenda forward? So let's look at some examples of these. Okay, so for fiduciary governance, we're talking about board members working alongside staff members. So this is a symbiosis, this is teamwork, you're collaborating together, and you're looking obviously at budget issues and financial issues and compliance issues, and again, monitoring the programs and assuring that your board members are adhering to their own policies, whether those are social media policies or conflict of interest policies or policies having to do with whether or not board members are going to run for office. All those kinds of things. Those are all examples of fiduciary governance where the board can work with the staff to make sure these activities are carried out. Strategic governance is developing a fundraising plan And God knows how important that is right now, trying to figure out, do we need to shift our sources of revenue? You know, if you relied in the past on a special event, that might not be happening. So how are you going to restructure that, and what does that look like, and what are your contingency plans, and do you have reserves, and so on and so forth. Developing a marketing plan. Oh my goodness, there are so many organizations that I work with, and I've never heard of them before they call me. And I've lived in San Diego for 21 years. And I was at USD working with thousands of nonprofits. But there are 12,000 plus nonprofits in the county. And so getting your word out, who you are, your branding, your marketing, that's really important. We want everyone knows who the Red Cross is and what they do. Does everyone know what your nonprofit does and who you are? It's really important. And then thinking about new program opportunities and options. Those are all strategic examples of strategic duties. Okay, so how do we get there? What do we do? The first thing that we do is we have to have a really, really clear description of how we engage board members. This is super important. What are the expectations? A lot of times I will see board member duty descriptions. I call them the job descriptions for board members. And the first line will say something like, we expect board members to show up to 3/4 of our meetings every year. And I think, that's bananas. When I was and I'm teaching this semester, but when I was a full-time professor, and now, I don't say to my students, and I expect you to come to at least 3/4 of the classes. I expect my students to come to every class because it's valuable. And if they can't be there, just like a board member, why? What's the reason? So what are the expectations? I want to see board members who are serving on committees, and we're going to talk about that more in a minute, so that board members are partnering with you and they're very engaged in this work in a way that makes sense. I want to see board members helping in some way with fundraising, and maybe you ask board members to give a gift that's personally meaningful to each member of the board. And that means different things to different people. So the board member duties need to be very, very clear to understand the financial statements and so on and so forth. So before you're even thinking about recruiting a board member, you have to go back and say, what are our expectations? And are we clear about what it is that we want people to do? This is really important. So what I want to do, Walter, let's go to the next one, is this clear description of board duties and clear policy documents that you want your board members to understand. I mentioned earlier social media. Board members sometimes have the best intentions, but they go awry on social media because they're posting pictures of children when you don't want them to, or something like that. So you have to have really clear social media policies. You want to have clear gift acceptance policies, all kinds of policies. So how do you know if your policies are any good? Well, fortunately, we have the Nonprofit Institute has this fabulous, fabulous resource, which is this online library that has multiple samples of board manuals and documents that you can access for free. Isn't that your favorite word? Free? I love it. So you can go on and look at these samples that have been developed by graduate students under the auspices of very knowledgeable faculty members, so that you know what you're getting is good. I just want to pause for a minute to see, does anyone have any questions so far? Feel free to send me something in the chat box, and Walter will help filter it to me because I'm kind of looking ahead and sideways and doing all kinds of crazy things here, and will respond to questions that you might have as I'm talking. So don't be shy. Speak up. All right, so Walter, let's move on to the next one. So what's really important in reframing your board governance structure and reframing it around these fiduciary duties, the duties that make the train run on time, and the strategic duties that help the organization go from where you are right now to where you want to head in the future, is really having clarity on your strategic direction, and your strategic priorities, right? Because you need the board to help you get from where you are right now to where you want to go. So you have to know where you want to go. And what does that mean to you? Does that mean expanding the number of people you serve? Does that mean having a strategy that's going to help you retool some of your programs so that they can be virtual, so that you can reach more people? Is it sending videos to your donors so that they understand the value of your work, even though they might not be able to get together with you? What are your strategies? What are your strategic priorities? So you need to identify those as a first go around. And I've given you, as part of this workshop, a worksheet that you can use afterwards and go back with your staff and board and really sort through what the priorities are. Once you know what those priorities are, then we're going to determine what committees we need. And no two boards have the same committees. And one thing that I always say, which I find so interesting, is I walk into board meetings or organizations where I'm asked to do board work, and people will say, well, our board is wonderful because we meet every month. Well, sometimes that's wonderful and sometimes it's not. Because what I really want the board to be doing is I want them to be collaborating with the staff on working committees that are going to meet the fiduciary and the strategic needs of the organization. And so sometimes it's better for a board to meet 6 times a year or 4 times a year so that they can be working on their committees in between board meetings. And then the board meetings become committee reports of the board. So it's not the staff serving everything on that cloche, right? It's the board members working with the staff to present their work and to ask other board members, are we going in the right direction? Does this make sense? So when you figure out your strategic priorities, that will help you determine the committee structure. That will also help you determine how many board members you need to be effective. Now, most nonprofit boards have between 11 and 15 members. So what if you have 5 committees? Wow. How do you spread all those bodies out among those 5 committees? Well, sometimes you can invite people to serve on working committees of the board who aren't board members. So they might be a volunteer on your marketing committee, even a volunteer on your fundraising committee. Maybe you have someone who is a retired auditor who's volunteered to chair your audit committee. Some of those people who are the volunteer members, you want to vet to see if they would make good future board members. So that's really, really valuable. So you think about, what are the committees that I really need to serve these fiduciary and strategic functions? how many board members do I need? Because you want a board member at least to chair all those committees. And then how many people do I need to make those committees effective? All right? So that's what we want to think about.
I have a question.
Oh, yes. So differences between small and larger, you know, Roberto, I don't see a big difference. And let me tell you why. Again, when I took over the CDC Association, which was this trade association of 60 community-based nonprofit developers that worked all over Massachusetts, I was the only staff person. It was me. I had 60 board members. My board members were spread all over the state of Massachusetts, which thankfully is a very small state. It's about twice the size of San Diego County in terms of population. And so I organized the board into 10 different working committees. And believe me, they knew much more about community development than I did. My job was to say, what do you need? What do you want? How do we move this thing forward? If you have a very small board right now, and sometimes I'll start working with an organization and they'll have a 3-member board and a 5-member board. I still want you to roll it back and say, okay, in our ideal world, if we're thinking about our fiduciary needs and our strategic needs, how many committees do we need? And what kind of people do we need to get on the board who have that kind of technical expertise? Maybe you need somebody who knows something about programs and program evaluation. Maybe you need somebody who is younger than I am and is really cool at social media and marketing and all that stuff. You know, what do you need? And when you recruit people, and I'll get to this also a little later on, you're recruiting people with 2 things in mind. You recruit people because you say, our organization is focused on small animal rescue. That's what we do. And you love animals, and you're also brilliant at social media. So we need you because you have a heart for what we do, and you have skills that we need. And that should be the message, whether you're a teeny organization or a medium organization or the symphony, right? Because you want people who have the heart for what you do and who have skills and abilities that will help you move the organization forward. All membership organization, no paid staff and volunteers. Okay, so what strategies do we recommend to recruit board members and leadership volunteers? It's the same thing. I worked recently with La Raza Lawyers Association. They are an all-volunteer, they're a 501c6 organization because they're a business association, and they have a 501c3 charitable arm as well. They're all volunteers. God bless them. They're just absolutely wonderful. And so when you have an organization like that, you've got to get together with the people who right now are on your steering committee or your executive committee, whatever you call that core group, and you've got to pull it back and you have to figure out what are our fiduciary and what are our strategic functions. And if I didn't tell you before that I love to repeat myself, I do. It's my favorite thing. Fiduciary, strategic. What do you need? How do you organize it? Well, I think the best way to keep people motivated, and I'm hoping, can everyone see all these questions, Walter, or just me? Good. The best way to keep people motivated is by engaging them. Because years ago, I was asked to join a board, a very prestigious board in San Diego. I was all excited. I joined the board. They said, the CEO said that he was excited to have me. And I got to the board meeting and they didn't want me to do anything. They just wanted me to listen to what the staff had to say. And that's a waste of my time. You know, I'd rather be at home watching a show on Netflix than doing that. So I find the best way to engage people is to have them doing something that's real and meaningful. The other thing that is really important, is to thank people. Because people are volunteering, and let's face it, we're all stressed, especially right now during COVID. I mean, if there's a person on this planet who is not stressed, I want to meet them and give them a hug, because it's crazy. So just to say, wow, I just so appreciate you, and mean it, and not just be, you know, a drive-by, thanks for doing that, but a real heartfelt thanks, I think, is very, very important. Okay, so I want to get to the third point on this slide, but keep the questions coming too, because they're good and I love them. But my third point on the slide is really important, because it's what changes do we need to make to our governance structure in order to make this happen. And that mostly has to do with taking a look at your bylaws. And again, if your bylaws say we have to meet monthly or we have to meet 10 times a year, you might want to revisit that and put something in that's a lot more flexible. If your bylaws for some reason prohibit volunteers from serving on board committees, you might want to revisit that as well. You want to think through your practices. And maybe you say, it's too scary to go from meeting once a month to meeting 4 times a year. So we want to start out meeting 6 times a year. I'm okay with that. But just focus on your committees doing substantial and meaningful work, because that is what is going to help move the organization forward. Oh, Nicole, so how would I prioritize strategic planning and fundraising? I think it's a little bit of both. I think when you do strategic planning, you really have to look at what's in the environment right now. What are our opportunities? What do the people we serve need, or how can we serve them best? And a lot of times that will help to identify new fundraising avenues. So that's my opinion, but I know my friend Sally Dedden Bixby is also doing a workshop right now on fundraising, and she might have a different perspective, but she and I collaborate and talk all the time, so it's just my opinion. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. So this is a really simple sample committee structure. You can see the committees that I proposed, but it really, the committee structure, don't just take this off the slide and say, yay, now I'm going to do a happy dance because Pat told me that these are the committees that I need, and now I can rock on and go forward with this. Because each boards are like people. Nonprofits are like people. You know, we're fundamentally all the same, but we're really not. You know, we look different, we act different, we've got different things going on in our lives. And so each committee structure for the nonprofit has to be different depending on what that nonprofit needs. Let me give you an example. I worked with the San Diego Children's Discovery Museum, 5 years ago, I think it was 5 years ago, to go through a process like this where we really thought very carefully about what kind of committee structure they needed and what kind of changes to their bylaws they needed and that kind of thing. And Javier Guerrero, who is now the executive director of Coastal Roots Farm, was the executive director of the Children's Discovery Museum. And if you know Javier Guerrero is one of, in my opinion, the most brilliant nonprofit EDs in San Diego. I think he's enormously talented. And the man wakes up every morning with 7,000 ideas in his brain. He just is a very expansive thinker, and he just sees opportunities wherever he goes. He's amazing. And so what he needed was a futures committee, because he needed a group of board members who were very strategic, who could sit with him and say, okay, you want to expand the programs this way? Which is the best option? What is the data? What do we know about these various opportunities? So they could help him as thought partners consider the best strategic directions. So there is an example. Sometimes you have, for instance, I worked with Junior Achievement several years ago. They own a beautiful facility, which I don't know if it's being used right now, but has been used for many years, at Mission Gorge. So when you think about committees and committee structures, do you need a facilities committee to somehow oversee that, or can you merge looking at the facility with your finance committee? So it's those kind of things that you have to ask your organization in terms of what makes sense for you. Do you need a separate board nominating committee, or is that going to fall within your executive committee, etc.? But this is a simple framework that you're welcome to borrow, but I want you to think about it as well. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Okay, so then we're going to clarify the expectations with your current board members, right? And if someone says, wow, okay, so all of a sudden you want me to serve on a working committee, and you want me to meet in between meetings, and I need to meet with the staff, and I need to do all this stuff, and to be honest, I just am feeling like I can't handle it right now because I've got 2 kids at home, and I'm homeschooling, and I'm working, and it's COVID, and it's a little crazy. And you say to that person, you know what, Joe, Maria, whatever the person's name is, we love you. You've been wonderful. If you can't do this, we understand. Because what is not acceptable is to have some board members who are working their fannies off, and other board members who are kind of checking in. That doesn't do it. And once in a while, you'll come across a situation that breaks your heart, where you have a wonderful board member who is loyal and works hard, and all of a sudden the person gets sick, really sick. You have to say to that person, we love you, and we want you to take a leave of absence, and we're going to hold your seat for you until you get back. That way you don't have to worry about the quorum. That way the person doesn't have to worry about not doing their duty, and that way you're not setting a precedent that it's okay for people not to show up at every board meeting, right? So if people feel like what you're asking is too much, you give them a virtual hug, because you can't give them a real hug these days, in this day and age, and you say bye, thank you so much. And you recruit new people who have the energy and love and passion for what it is you do. And hopefully you have some kind of plan to celebrate those people, and maybe when the COVID fog lifts and we can all get back together, you have a special, I don't know, at your annual meeting, you do something to honor their contributions, and that's really, really nice. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So then, we've got to figure out, who do we want on the bus? Because we may have some people who have fallen off the bus, right? Because of all the reasons that I mentioned. And when you're recruiting people, you're going to have things, you're going to be so organized, people are just going to love you. First, you're going to go to every board recruitment meeting, whether it's via Zoom or in a cafe where you're socially distanced, and you're going to say, here's some information about our organization and what we do. Here's a description of our board member duties. This is what we expect of board members. Here's a description of our working committees. We have these 5 working committees. And what I was thinking is the reason I wanted to recruit you is because we really could use someone with good finance skills. And you also love ballet. And that's what we're all about, or whatever your organization's about. So you want to present those documents up front. And maybe the person meeting with you is going to say, you know what, you're right. I love ballet or the environment or fill in the blank, whatever your nonprofit is. And I do have a brain for finance. Thanks for recognizing that. But I can't be on a board right now because I'm just running my business and it's just really crazy. And then you say to them, would you be on a committee? Would you be willing to do that? See if what they say. And if they say, I'm not sure, then you say, who do you know who you think is as wonderful as you are, who would be willing to be on our finance committee and who also cares about this issue as much as you do? So that's how you recruit people. You've got that 2-pronged approach. You're recruiting them because they love, 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 love your organization and what you do. And you're recruiting them because they have skills. As Napoleon Dynamite would say, you got good nunchuck skills, right? So you're recruiting the person for that. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this is what board members want. And by the way, I have to include my dog Miles in every presentation that I do, so there he is. So what's the mission, right? What's the strategy? This requires you to think, what's your strategy? How do you do your work, right? What are the expectations and what's the meeting culture of the organization? And the board meeting cultures, let me tell you, they're all over the map. Some, and even on Zoom, they're all over the map. Some meetings, some board members like to say, well, we'll call the meeting for 6, but we really want to start at 6:15 because we want all the board members to have 15 minutes just to check in and say hi and, spend some time together. Other organizations say, our meetings are an hour and a half. Start at 6, they end at 7:30, we are done. We're reports, committee reports, we get through it, yeah. So you want to convey that because it's a match. It is that a match with the person's personality. When you're in real life, after COVID, some board members meet over a meal. Some board members meet over wine. What is the culture? How do you meet? What does it look like? And they need to understand that. Yes, I could speak to term limits. I think term limits are really important. And the reason I think term limits are important is because organizations need new energy and new ideas. So I always recommend term limits. Now, if you're really reluctant to let people go, then you can say, well, we'll give you, I usually recommend term limits that are 3 years, 3-year terms with an option to renew for another 3 years, and then a year break before you can renew. I also recommend, and we're getting into bylaws stuff, that 1/3 of your board turn over at any given time because that gives you new energy and new expertise coming in to the organization. So that is my recommendation for term limits. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. Partnership. So I'm really, really excited to talk to you about this because recently I did a board reimagination project with Arts for Learning. And it was so much fun. We had such a great time because we talked a lot about this issue. How do we engineer a healthy and constructive board staff partnership? Because that's so key to all of this. So let's go to the next slide. So there are 5 steps to this partnership. And by the way, I just want to mention, some of you know that I write a monthly blog, and you can find it if you connect with me on LinkedIn, or you can find it at patlibby.com, which is my website. And if you want, you can sign up for the monthly, to get the monthly blog. And I recently wrote a blog on the subject, and it was reshared, had 1,300 hits, and everybody loved it, because I think people are dying to talk about this issue. It's so, so important. So the first thing you want to do is to engage, if you are the executive director or the CEO, or if you are a staff person who is staffing, for instance, a program committee or a fundraising committee or a marketing committee or whatever it is, you want to engage the committee chair in a dialogue about the next meeting. And the meeting has to be a meeting where people are making decisions, right? You need to say, we are dealing with these issues, and we need your partnership, and we need your help. And so these are the issues that I want to discuss at the meeting. Does that make sense to you? So we're going to get an agreement on the agenda, and then, this is really important, your board chair or your committee chair should say back to you, or you should say to that person, what information do we need to make these decisions, right? If we're thinking about moving some of our programs on Zoom, I'm assuming you've already done that, but you know, what are the considerations? What kind of technology do we need? What kind of training do we need? What training do people need on the other end if they're parents or children or low income or elderly or whatever? What kind of resources do we need to make this happen? So what kind of preparation does the staff need to do so they can send out information to the board members or to the committee members in advance of the meeting, so that those committee members or board members can exercise their fiduciary of care? So they can read through it, they can think about it, maybe they even want to do a little research, and they can come prepared with real questions. So these are the first two important steps. Okay, next. Then, I like to remind everyone to be prepared. So, hi, have you read it? You know, send them an email. Send them the materials, hopefully a week in advance of the meeting. Send them a reminder 2 or 3 days in advance saying, by the way, just want to make sure you read the materials and you're prepared with any questions. Make sure that you and the chair are on the same page about any decisions that have to be reached at the meeting. Because if you're not, what can happen is decision paralysis or meeting paralysis, where people are meeting and they say, I don't know, what do you want to do? I don't know, what do you want to do? You should have enough information, and people will have thought about it in advance, that they are ready to come prepared to make decisions. And you say, folks, the purpose of this meeting is to make these decisions, right? And then at the end of the meeting, you want to be clear and you want to reiterate, or even during the meeting, okay, if I'm hearing you all, these are the decisions that we've made. Is that right? And everyone says yes. Okay, in order to do that, then we need to do this. Right. And then the next steps are this. And that will be probably what our next meeting will be about. What often happens, and I have written several blogs about good meeting management, is people think that the purpose of meetings is to share information. That's a small part of it. The purpose of meetings is to make decisions, right? So if we go back to what we were talking about earlier, we're talking about these committees. Your marketing committee is going to come to the board meeting and say, this is what we've been thinking through. This is the direction we would like to go in. This is why. What do you think, board members? And your fundraising committee is doing the same thing, and your program committee is doing the same thing, and your executive committee is probably making the trains run on time, so their report might be more sharing information than decision making, but most of your meetings should be about making decisions, because that's what moves it forward. Okay, and then lastly, that's how we have respect and cooperation and collaboration, because we have this partnership where the board members and the staff members are working together. So the board members have been chosen because, say it with me, they love your organization, right? And they have the skills you need to move it forward. If you don't have enough board members, you're going to recruit people to serve on those board committees, who you hope will be so engaged and impressed with all the work that you do that someday they will become board members. But in the meantime, you can use their expertise to help you move your organization forward, and that's really important. A lot of times I've heard that, oh, it should just be the executive director who is handling all these committees. Well, when I started out at the CDC Association, that was true, because I was the only staff person. But eventually, we were fortunate and we grew a 10-person staff. So I did not need to staff all of those committees. I staffed some. Other people staffed others. So the work got divided. What I have found in my 40+ years of working with nonprofits is that people want to work in partnership, and they really want to help. And that's why they join the board, because they want to help advance you. So let's open it up to see if there are other questions that are coming in. Well, you know, that's hard. I would say, Kathy, when people don't understand this kind of leadership, what I like to do is, you could say, I went to this webinar today and it was really cool. Or, have you read these blogs by my old professor, Pat Libby? She's got some interesting thoughts on this. You can try to get people to read and think about these issues. I also think, again, people are feeling so stressed in this day and age. Maybe one way to approach it is by saying, you know, we're all so stressed during COVID. I can't imagine how you must be feeling having to shoulder this organization right now. We board members really want to help, and I've been doing some thinking and reading about strategies for engaging board members and having them work with staff in more constructive ways, and I'd like to share those with you because maybe we could take some of the burden off of you. So that's one way to approach it. Well, if we go to the last slide, ta-da, there it is. There's my website. And the reason that I'm sending you there, patlibby.com, is because I have blogs on all kinds of things. As I said, I wrote a blog last month that was on this topic of this shared leadership. I have lots of blogs on board management. I have blogs on good meeting management. One even has a PDF that you can print out and share. And I think I sent that to you along with this workshop for you to make use of. So I'm just going to give it another minute to see if there are any other questions that come across my screen. And if not, I'm just going to wish you all a really good day and good luck moving forward. And as I tell everyone I speak to these days, wear a mask and wash your hands 10,000 times a day. Okay. Great. Thank you. I'm sorry, now you can hear me. Let's try that again. Okay. So, it has to do with clarifying the expectations of the board members. So start with your executive committee or discussion of the full board, where you all agree on what your expectations are. You expect everyone to come to all the board meetings, except they absolutely can't. You expect everyone to serve on a working committee. You expect everyone to sign confidentiality policies, conflict of interest policies, all those important policy documents. And once you get an agreement on that, if you have board members that say, yeah, and then they don't show up, then it's the responsibility of whomever is chairing the board to call that person and say to that person, look, we love you, you're wonderful, but you're not being wonderful to us. And this is not working for us. So the chair of the board needs to basically gently and in a kind way fire the board members who are not showing up. And if it's a group that needs to be fired because all of a sudden your board, went from 11 to 5 core people, that's okay. Because if those 5 people or those 3 people or whoever is left on the island loves Centro Cultural de la Raza and have the skills and the passion to bring it forward, that's what you need. And then you lay out your strategy for what your priorities are, and then you find those people using those techniques that I gave you who are willing to come on board and help you move the organization forward. Yes, you're welcome to email me, and my email address, it's very complicated. Are you ready? It's patlibby@patlibby.com. So feel free to send me an email. Any other questions? I'm so glad. I love the questions coming in. Nobody has said, how have you been doing this for 41 years? I can't believe it. Was that it, Walter? Okay, I want to thank Walter for helping me. This is very fun to do. All right, and if another question comes in, I'll pop back on again in a second.